Hello and welcome to my code presentation of my project in the course TDDD27 Advanced Web Programming at Linköping University. I've created this application in Svelte for the front end. I've divided up the different views into components in Svelte, and I've decided to use stores to handle and store data on client side when it's needed. And I decided to use stores since I can then subscribe to them and access their values throughout the project instead of having to send data up and down the component tree. So I just want to show the stores first. I have a few of them here on the left hand side. All of them are custom stores and they look pretty much the same. We declare some the variables used in them, and then we have a clear function and then some set and remove and add functions in each of the stores. Pretty basic stuff here. But then if we go back to the main component of the project, which is the app.svelte component, we have our basic imports and variable declarations here. We have some standard functions that flip Boolean values back and forth. We clear some of the store data when needed. But one more important function is this on-mount lifecycle hook here. So when the user connects to the website, we send a request to the backend and they check if the user is authenticated through a previous session. If they are, we automatically log them in. And then I divided the page into a grid area with 4 different areas. 2 for each header, 1 for the ingredient header, 1 for the recipe header, 1 for the ingredients, and 1 for the recipes. So the ingredient header, we can see here, there's some basic text and titles, and then we have the ingredient search bar as a component, which we could see in the project screencast. We type in, for example, beef, and we get suggestions back. So this component looks like this. It's an input field, and when the user, and to avoid flooding the server, backend server with requests, we wait, after the user types, we wait 500 milliseconds before sending the request. If they haven't typed for 500 milliseconds, we send a request with the search string. We get and which then makes a REST call to the API, and we get the data back, which we put into our ingredient suggestion store. And we can then see in the app that in the ingredient search bar that we have the ingredient search suggestions component, which then just fetch data from the suggestion store and outputs it as a list. And if the user clicks one of those, we take that ingredient object and store it in the ingredient store instead. And in the app.svelte component, if we move down to the ingredient area of the grid, we can see that we have the ingredients component, which just takes all of these ingredients in the ingredient store and creates the buttons for them. And if the user clicks one of those buttons, we remove that ingredient from the store. So that's how the ingredient part of the website work. And then if we go back to the main component, the app component, we can see that we have some a few conditional rendering arguments here. And that is to decide what component and what view to show to the user, depending on if they're logged in or not, and if depending on what button they have clicked. For example, if they are logged in and they click the wizard hat, which is the user icon, they are shown their user profile, for example. And we also define what header they should be viewed if they click the favorite button or not when they're logged in. And these user profile, sign up and login are pretty simple. The sign up and login are just 2 forms that take data and send to the backend and to sign up the user or log in the user. We will cover more how this works when we look at the backend. The user profile just shows them their email and their ability to sign out and delete their account. We can now move and check on the start page header. And the start page header looks like this. So it's just some basic text in the header again and an icon, and then we can see that we have the recipe search bar. The recipe search bar works pretty much the same way as the ingredient search bar did, where we write text and we can, with the delay, and then we get suggestions from the backend, which we store in a store and then is viewed. But a little difference here is that when we make the call to get our recipes, we check if we have any ingredients, and if the user have chosen any ingredients, then we make a call automatically to the backend to get recipes based on these ingredients, which then are populated into the recipe area. And recipe suggestions are shown the same way as the ingredient suggestions, so there's no new code there. So the recipes is shown through this recipes component, and it looks like this. And it basically takes all the recipes that we have stored in the recipe store and creates recipe cards from them. And the recipe card has a few different components in them. We have our basic imports and variables, and these variables are used to decide if we show the side navigation panel, which has more information about the recipe, or not, by binding this show sidebar, these variables into a variable inside these components, and we will look more into these components then. And if they are true, we show that component. Otherwise, the card itself is a recipe card image, which just takes the image component, or image data, and then sets up a div tag and image tag with that image. There's nothing fancy going on in that one. The recipe card info, on the other hand, is a little bit more interesting. So the recipe card info takes the recipe and then creates up the HTML code, and it just goes through, check if there are any missed ingredients that we have not used, and then tells us which ingredients the user is missing. Or if we have all the ingredients, it tells us that. And this uses some functions to get the status from the backend of if the user has favorited the recipe or not to show on the recipe cards. And then we can go into the recipe card side nav component, and that is just the one that slides in from the right hand side. There's some basic HTML, and then it just goes through our stores and the recipe. It goes through the recipe to find the information about the ingredients to display. It also has the link to the full recipe. And then we have the unauthorized component that we also use, and it looks like this. It's basically a pop-up with a backdrop. It's a pop-up with a backdrop to show that, oh, something went wrong. And this is triggered when, from the recipe card info, if the user clicks the heart icon but is not logged in, we get a 401 status code back from the backend, and then we dispatch a message that says to toggle the unauthorized variable. So we send it back up to the recipe card from the recipe card info, and then we toggle the show unauthorized to true, which toggles the unauthorized module itself, the component itself. And then that gets toggled back when the user clicks OK or outside of the window. So that's how the recipe card and recipes work. And then if we go back to the app component, then we also have how favorites are handled. So when a user favorites a recipe, it gets added to a favorite recipe store. And those are then viewed when the on the favorites page header, the user can access these. So the favorites page header is like the other header, except that we show a favorite search bar instead, which works pretty much like the other search bar, but instead it sets a string in the favorite store, that is then used to lexicographically filter the recipes. So instead of getting suggestions, we filter our already saved recipes to further find recipes. For example, say if we have 100 saved recipes, we want to find all those that are named something with Thai in them, for example, then we can filter on that instead. And then so when the user clicks this favorite icon when they're logged in, we trigger the favorite recipes component. And the favorite recipes component is like the recipe components. It sets up recipe cards in the exact same way. And then we have a few different other components here on the left-hand side, and these components are either just some basic form, like the user profile is a basic form that fetches some data and shows some data, and then just triggers logout functionality or some other thing in the backend. And we then have some icon components that are just basic components. Basic icons that are reusable components for when you use this a lot. Furthermore, I would like to shortly just show this request library that I created. So here we have generic post and get request functions. So that is how the frontend is built up, and we will now move on to the Flask backend. So here we create our Flask backend. We import a database with using SQLite. Then we also use the Flask login library, package, to handle user login and logout functionality. And here we have our routes. I used the blueprints in Flask to do this. So we set up the blueprint with URL prefixes. And then we have our different routes and their functionality, which here they get the arguments for a get request. They get the arguments from the requests that were sent to the backend, and then we unpack it and then we send it to the Spinacular API. We then get the data back and we send it back to the front end. And the front end uses fetch to make these requests, and here we use REST requests with the get and post. So in the search we can get different ingredients and recipes, and in our main we have our main routes and how to serve the different svelte views. In favorites we can retrieve our favorites. These are all different Spinacular API endpoints that we just call and get data back and fetch the data we want to. We also have some different error handling in the functions where we send the messages back and we set status codes on them so we can use it. And I just want to go into the database a little quick here. So we have three models that we use. So we have the user model consisting of a user. And here we have a relationship between the recipes and the users. So the recipe consists of an ID, and then we have a intermediary table that consists of the user ID and the recipe ID. So we can create a many-to-many relationship. So a user can favorite many recipes, and a recipe can be favorited by many users. And here we also hash and salt the password that the user supplies by using Worksug and their check password hash. So when the user supplies it and it is retrieved in the authentication routes, it is hashed and salted. So the authentication itself, blueprint and routes, here we have the sign up where we get the information from the user. Here we hash and salt the password as I stated. We then create the different users and store them in our database. And then login route, the same. We verify the supplied password to see if it matches the stored hash in the database, and then return it back. And here I've used Flask login, so I don't have to set up the tokens and WebSockets myself. This is handled by Flask login itself. So I can just call login user and it sets up all of that and create cookies and stuff. Then we use the login required decorator for stuff that requires the user to be logged in. So if the user is not logged in and they try to call this functionality, they get a 401 error message back, which we handle on the client side then to say, oh, sorry, you're not logged in, for example. We also then extra validate our sign-up data, so it is validated on the client side first when the user wants to sign up. Then we get it, and if it's correct on the client side, it's sent to the backend, and then the backend validates it again, so there hasn't been any shenanigans on the way, for example. And that is how the backend is built up using REST calls to our Spoonacular API. And that is the entire project. There's obviously more code than shown, but this is a short overview. Thank you very much for listening.